Hi Year 4, I'm going to be reading the next few chapters of The Time-Travelling Cat and the Egyptian Goddess. Chapter 7. It was a Thursday. He came home from school and she wasn't there. She wasn't in the street and she wasn't on the front doorstep. She wasn't in the hall or the kitchen. The house felt cold and grey. He started to feel scared as he climbed the stairs, hardly dared to enter his bedroom. What if the stone cat was on the cupboard beside his bed? It wasn't. But he found it a few minutes later, under the bed, thick with dust, as if it had been there for a long time. As if it had been knocked off the cupboard and pushed under the bed with the usual clobber that gets lost under beds, socks, comics and shoes. He didn't know what to think. She wasn't in the garden or in the shed. I don't care. He closed the shed door and Mrs. Ewing poked her spiky head through the hedge. Looking for your pussycat, are you? Don't worry, she'll be back. Cats wander, you know. Ellie came round. She took Car's dish into the back garden and banged it with a spoon, and all the time she called Car's name. Mrs. Ewing complained about the noise, but Ellie didn't hear her. She did stop, but only while she went to the front door, where she started to bang an empty milk bottle and call again. Lisa arrived, but went out immediately to search the nearby streets. When she came back, she said she hadn't found her alive, but neither had she found her squished. She had found a squished one in Fitzwarren Gardens. It was horrible, she said. I don't care. Lisa gasped. Ellie told her that Topher didn't mean it. Soon after that, Lisa went home. Ellie made some tea. Then she went home. It was her piano lesson tonight. Topher wasn't surprised about that anymore, now that she'd explained how she felt the sounds vibrating, just as she felt Car's purring. Car's purring. It hurt to think about it. Dad tried to cheer him up. Everybody tried to cheer him up. Ah, Topher, don't be upset. She'll be back. I'm not upset. Cats wonder, you know. It was Thursday. Liver and bacon, Car's favourite, but she wasn't there to eat the leftovers, which was most of Topher's helping because he didn't like it very much. She wasn't there at bedtime. He dusted the stone cat and placed it carefully on the middle of his bedside cupboard so that it couldn't fall off. Then he picked it up again, breathed on it, rubbed it on his pyjamas, but still it looked dull. Alike, yet unlike Car. It looked lifeless, even with the lamplight shining on it. It was lifeless. As he put the lamp out, he willed the statue to come back to life, to wake him in the night, but it didn't even glow as it had done before. Nothing woke him in the middle of the night, and Carl wasn't there in the morning. He kept a lookout for her on the way to school, and for squished ones, though he hardly dare look at these. All the roads around Archway roared with traffic. When he got to school, Ellie came rushing up. Has Car... No. They searched the school grounds. At lunchtime, they asked permission to leave the premises and search outside. Miss Crabbe said no. She didn't think it was a good idea, not without their parents' permission. She also said, don't worry, Topher, she'll be back. Cats wonder, you know. Topher felt like strangling her. Car wasn't there when he got home. She stayed away all weekend. She didn't come back on Monday and Tuesday. Lisa said that Jodie said Car was almost certainly time-travelling. Topher told Lisa to tell Jodie to get lost. He began to hate everybody. Above all, he hated the stone cat beside his bed. Then Car was back, after a whole week away. He found her on his bed one Friday when he went to change out of his uniform. Car! She hardly stirred. He lay beside her, buried his face in her fur, loving its musky smell. She was in a deep sleep. Where have you been, Car? Have you been far? He lifted a hind paw. The pads were black and shiny, not worn at all, so she hadn't been far. Have you been hiding, Car? Where? Why? She was very tired. He stayed with her, curled round her. He couldn't leave, couldn't disturb her to take her downstairs. And that was how Dad found them. When he came home, both fast asleep on the bed. Topher woke to the friendly smell of fish and chips and his dad's hand ruffling his hair. Fish and chips from the shop. It must be Friday. Great! Everything was great. What are you so happy about, son? Look. Topher moved aside. Usually on Fridays, Car met Mr. Hope at the door. She would jump on the hall stand and try to nudge open the newspaper with her nose. Today it was a full minute before the smell of fish reached her. When it did, they saw her nose twitch first. Then she looked up, yawned and stretched, and all the time her movements were getting faster and faster. Her pink nose was whiffling. Then she sprang from the bed and followed them downstairs, her tail quivering. Where did you go, Car? It was after dinner, and Topher was half-heartedly playing on his computer. Car was on his knee, watching the cursor, occasionally batting it with her paw. His dad was reading the paper. I reckon she's found an old lady who will feed her fresh salmon, his dad said. You don't like fresh salmon, do you, Car? Tell me, where did you go? And then something extraordinary happened. Car stepped onto the keyboard, as she had done a few weeks ago, and carefully spelled out a message. Again! Look at this, Dad! Mr. Hope glanced over his shoulder. Blimey! Ha! Car did it! Ha! Clever cat, or clever Topher. It wasn't me, Dad. But Mr. Hope went back to his paper. He obviously thought Topher was joking, and Topher didn't bother to explain, though he needed to talk about it to someone. Something very strange was happening. It would be good if he had some evidence. Carefully, he pressed exit and save. Chapter 8. Bubastis. His dad had said it was in Egypt, ancient Egypt. Car had written it twice. Had she been to Bubastis? How? Topher turned to ask her, wondering if she would speak as well as write, but she was at the door, scratching, making it very clear that she wanted to go outside. He opened the door and let her into the kitchen where the cat flap was. Then he went upstairs. Bubastis. He searched for it in one of his books about Egypt. He had lots now because he'd brought his mother's books up to his room. This one was about architecture. Bubastis wasn't in the index, but he leafed through it anyway. It had lots of pictures, mostly of magnificent palaces. They had vast halls with massive square entrances, no archways because the Egyptians didn't know how to make those, and wide courtyards with richly painted columns. And in the large rooms were small ones, inner sanctuaries where statues of the gods were kept. Gods. He still found this hard to take in. They looked more like birds and animals. They had the heads of birds and animals, but they were worshipped as gods because they were believed to be their cars or doubles. Now his heartbeat quickened, for there, in front of him, was a beautiful cat in a shrine lined with gold, and the caption beneath said it was the goddess Bastet in Bubastis. Made of bronze, she also took the form of a living cat, it said. In ancient Egypt, people depended on cats, and they worshipped them. What? All of them? This doubles business was complicated. He read on. Real cats were prized because they protected the corn supplies from rats and mice, and because any one of them might be the goddess. And it was in Bubastis that the festival of Bastet was celebrated. He read it several times to be sure. The worshippers travelled in barges along a tributary of the Nile to Bubastis. On reaching Bubastis, they celebrated the festival with vast quantities of wine and elaborate sacrifices. His thoughts raced ahead. Bubastis? Was that where Car went? That's what she'd written. Was she a time-travelling cat? It wasn't just time she would have to travel through. Egypt was thousands of miles away. Was it possible? Topher wished she would come in, wished she would speak to him, wished that he was cleverer. Maybe then he would understand. A time-travelling cat? It was a crazy idea, though perhaps not, if what old Charlie had said about time was true. Outside, rain dribbled down the glass, blurring the lights of London, soft edging the buildings. Where was Car now? Had she gone again? Would she return? It was getting darker. A star appeared. He opened the window and called her. She hated the rain. Surely she would come in. She didn't, so he got ready for bed, closed the window because the rain was wetting the curtains. And she appeared a little later, scratching against the glass, streaking it with mud. You're double trouble, Car. He raised the sash and she came in, like a limbo dancer. Then she purred loudly while rubbing herself against him, drying her fur on his pyjama legs. He got back into bed and she licked his feet, her rough tongue tickling between his toes. Later she washed herself, licking the inside of her left foreleg, rubbing her face against the wet fur. Don't forget behind your ears, Car. She hadn't forgotten. She was using her paw like a flannel, drawing it elegantly over her head, pulling the ear forward, letting it flick back. What's Bubastis like, Car? She had finished washing, but ignored the question. She was circling now, lightly marking the bottom sheet with muddy paw prints. Are you flattening the reeds, Car? That's what Egyptian cats did before they slept by the river. But she didn't answer, for she was already asleep, her warm fur against his feet. It took Topher longer to settle. There were too many thoughts in his head, but when he did sleep, nothing woke him in the night. The following day, a Saturday, he went round to see Ellie. He left Car asleep on his bed. He needed to talk about what had happened. It was difficult talking to Ellie, there was no doubt about that. But when you did make yourself clear, she was very understanding. You had to say things in a straightforward way. Ellie was straightforward too. Soon after they'd met, she'd asked, "Where's your mother?" and he said, "She's dead." And that was that. They knew where they stood. Then she'd told him about getting ill and becoming deaf when she was 8. He'd said, that was bad, and she'd said, not as bad as your mum dying. He liked the way she'd said dying, not like most people who, if they mentioned it at all, talked about losing your mother, as if he'd left her lying around somewhere. Ellie lived on Cheverton Road, 2 streets away. The Wentworths were noisy and untidy and lots of fun. They all joined in to give Ellie as much talking practice as they could, even her younger brothers, Russell and Luke. She needs lots of practice, because when you can't hear people talking, you can't hear yourself, so you don't know if you're pronouncing words properly. So that's why her voice sounded wonky. When Topher arrived, she was reading Dick Whittington to Russell the Brussel, who had just collapsed in giggles. He was rolling about the floor. Ellie was laughing too. It seemed she'd just said Dick Whittington's cat went on a chip instead of on a ship. Sh and ch were 2 sounds she often muddled. Topher wanted to speak to her alone, but he had to wait till she'd finished the story. Then Russell wanted them both to play with him. So they went to Waterloo Park to get some peace. But Ellie wasn't her usual attentive self. They sat on a bench facing one another so that she could lip read, but she kept looking at a grey squirrel in a waste paper basket. She asked him to tell her again. He felt stupid repeating it all. He thought that someone would overhear and think he was crazy, till he realised that no one was taking any notice. The bag lady on the bench opposite was busy feeding the pigeons. You could hardly see her, there were so many, and the man next to her on the grass was slowly rotating while standing on his head. Maybe the whole world was crazy. So he tried again, and this time she thought he was joking. "I'm not joking," he couldn't help shouting, and the grey squirrel shot up a tree. "Show me then," she shouted, so loudly that all the pigeons flew off the bag lady. So they set off for Topher's house, walking over Archway Bridge and down Fitzwarren Gardens, and he thought about Dick Whittington and his cat. Why hadn't he thought of it before? This was Dick Whittington territory. Fitzwarren was the name of the merchant whose ship had taken Dick's cat to the east. The Whittington Hospital was in Archway Road below the bridge. Wasn't there a commemorative plaque somewhere? He thought of asking Ellie, but decided it would only complicate matters, and matters were complicated enough. They walked in silence, but maybe there had always been magical cats in these parts. Could Dick's cat talk and write? He thought she'd made his fortune just by being a good mouser. There was a mouse, a headless one, on the doorstep when they reached home, but Carr wasn't around. He took Ellie into the sitting room and switched on the computer. Put in the disc he'd been playing on, and there, to his great relief, was the word. They both stared at it. Then he touched Ellie's arm so that she would look at him. I asked her where she had been, and she wrote that. Ellie listened, like an alert dog, her head slightly to one side. "Yes, you said." "Twice, she wrote it twice." "Yes." "But do you believe me?" It was very important that she said yes. Bubastis, that's in ancient Egypt, isn't it? She'd seen a programme about it on the telly. He noticed she didn't say yes. But she had seen the word in the British Museum. She'd been lots of times, she said, to the British Museum, not Bubastis. The Egyptian ruins were really interesting. There were lots of cats there, statues of cats, and dead ones made into mummies. He'd been with his mother. It was creepy. He tried to explain. Bubastis was where they had a cat festival to celebrate the goddess Bastet. She was a cat goddess. She knew, she said. That's what the programme had been about. But Carr couldn't have gone to Egypt, Topher. It's too far. Her face was always very expressive. It was obvious she thought he was balmy. She might have gone to the British Museum, but why? Now she looked baffled. Ellie, he wanted to say that if Carr could leave messages on a computer, she could do anything, but before he could get the words out, his dad came in and started talking about school. And by the end of the weekend, he thought he might as well go to the British Museum. He might find a clue there. After all, he couldn't go to ancient Egypt in search of Carr, and by Sunday night she still hadn't returned. He'd searched the neighbourhood several times, spent hours calling and tapping her dish, but she'd stayed away. When he went to bed, the stone cat seemed brighter, and when he put out the light, it glowed. His hopes rose, but in the morning it was still beside his bed, and there was no purring Carr at his feet. Stone stayed stone. Chapter 9. At breakfast, his dad was cheerful. "I think we should get Carr a name tag with her address on it. It's obvious she's got a second home somewhere. Cats often do that. But if the other person knew, they'd return her to us, or at least stop feeding her. I want to go and look for her. You can't, it's school." Ellie said she thought she might be in the British Museum. His dad wasn't listening. "I'll buy a tag and get it engraved on the way home. It'll be ready when she returns. He was picking up his briefcase. Don't worry, Topher, she'll come back. The door slammed, and the house felt cold and empty, as if everything in it was made of stone. Topher wanted Car badly. Now, he couldn't possibly concentrate on lessons, so he waited a bit, so as not to bump into anyone on their way to school, then set off. The British Museum must be worth a try. It wasn't. He found cats all right, hundreds of them, but none of them was real, and he made an idiot of himself talking to one right at the start. It was in a glass case in a darkened gallery. Spotlit, it stood in a pool of light and it was beautiful. Sacred to Bastet, the label said. Car? He didn't realise he'd spoken till he felt a girl looking at him. Then he moved away sharpish and didn't come back till he'd seen her leave the gallery. In the meantime, he had some thoughts and looked at a lot more cats. The one in the case was made of bronze. It had a gold ring through its nose and the eye of Horus round its neck. It looked like one he'd seen in a book, but it didn't look like Car. None of the cats did. They were about 20 in the case in front of him, most of them tiny. One was part of a ring. None of them had Car's beautiful markings, yet they were all Car's, a notice said, and all sacred to Bastet. As always, the doubles thing confused him utterly. He went and sat down on a leather bench and tried to decide exactly what he was looking for. Was it the live Car or her double? He didn't know. That was the trouble. There certainly weren't any live cats here. He was wasting his time. He should never have bunked off school. What do you make of that, then? An American woman was sitting herself beside him. She had earrings like parrots, and at first he thought she was talking to him. Then he noticed a boy the other side of her. They were both looking at a fat baboon. Great, Mum, it looks just like Pop. They laughed, punched one another in a friendly fight. Topher got up and walked away. Shortly afterwards, he found himself looking at a huge stone falcon, and its painted eye was staring at him. It was black and white, and really seemed to be staring. In fact, eyes seemed to be watching him from all over, including those of the attendant. She looked really suspicious, as if she were going to pounce at any moment. What are you doing all alone, boy? Why aren't you at school, and what have you done with your mother? He really ought to be going. He must make sure he got home before his father. That was daft. It was still morning, wasn't it? Perhaps he should go to afternoon school. He left the gallery, left the museum soon afterwards, after a swift tour upstairs. The galleries were full of Egyptian stuff, coffins and mummies and all sorts of things. Spooky. He didn't see Bubastis mentioned anywhere, so much for Ellie's memory. But when he walked out of the underground archway, there was a hoarding with Horus the falcon on it. It was an advert for Egypt Airways. The plane was called Horus, and there was a picture of the falcon on its side. Fly into the past, it urged. He wished he could. If only. He tried to cheer himself up. If only Car was waiting for him at home. She wasn't, but his father was. Topher was in deep trouble.